أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أم حسبت أن أصحاب الكهف والرقيم كانوا من آياتنا عجبا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters, Islam and Iman here in Melbourne, across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: what is the power of knowledge? We've been discussing the future of our community in light of Karbala, the eternal renaissance of the Hussaini Movement, and the future of our community. That is, where are we going? What's our plan? What's our agenda? What's our focus? If you start a business, if you start your schooling, if you start living in life, you have a goal. For example, you may have a goal of wanting to be a doctor, or a lawyer, or an engineer, or an entrepreneur, or a journalist, or an economist, or whatever your interest may be. And in pursuit of that journey, you make a goal. So you have to go through primary, and then secondary, college, and then you go through junior college, and you go to university, and you go through all of the motions of achieving your goal. Similarly, if you have a goal in your industry or in entrepreneurship of making a certain amount of revenue, maybe 100 million, 200 million, 300 million. Similarly, when it comes to this, we have to have goals for our own community to check where is it that we are going and how are we doing in terms of achieving that goal. That is, the future generation, what's our retention rate? What are our KPIs? How are we protecting? How many people are we keeping? How many people are engaged? How many people are physically here? Mentally they're somewhere else. How many people are mentally and physically here? How many people are regularly involved throughout the year? Or for example, what are the problems as a community that we're solving that they may have? What are the issues that we are using the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt to solve their problems and things that they have? So keeping these things in mind, we have to keep all of these things in mind. Now, this builds on today's conversation, which is the power of knowledge. Now, I want you to think about how much the Quran and Islam and Allah has emphasized knowledge. That is, over 800 verses of the Quran either implicitly or explicitly focus on tafakkur and tadabbur, reflection and contemplation. Toynbee, the historian who looked at the history of the world, when he looked at it, he said, I have not found any religion on the planet that emphasized knowledge more than Islam. I have not found any religion that made knowledge the center and access of its religion more than Islam. But if that were the case, you would find that the Muslims of the world should be progressing and ahead of everything in society. But there seems to be this gap between qawl and fi'l. There's a gap between words and actions. By theory and practice, there seems to be a gap. How can we close that gap? How can we mitigate that gap in order for us to have a flourishing community now, in 5, 10, 15, 100 years down the line? You know, the big countries of the world, they all plan on a 100-year scale. The Russias, the Americas, the Englands, the likes of the world. We sometimes need to think in terms of our planning, where are we going? And on that, we have a goal and a journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah is saying that there's a responsibility with respect to ilm that you and I have that we should be mindful of. So therefore, I want to look at what is Islam and the Quran saying about knowledge, number one. Number two, what have the Ahlul Bayt told us about knowledge? Is knowledge what is Islam's concept of knowledge as ilm? Is it one-dimensional or multi-dimensional? The next thing that I want to look at is what are examples of some of our scholars in terms of leadership and knowledge in leadership. In terms of this, then I want to look at why is this so important? What happens if we don't focus on this? What's your responsibility? What's my responsibility as followers of the Bayt today? And finally, how did Imam Hussain and his companions show us this notion of what it truly means to have knowledge of the highest caliber? This is our agenda for tonight. Wherever you are, here in Melbourne, across the globe, send us salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. At the first level, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as I've been mentioning in Surah Al-Kahf, He tells us about the likes of Ashab al-Kahf, and He tells us about Musa and Khidr, and He tells us about Dhul Qarnayn. And the idea is, look, Allah is telling in the story of Musa and Khidr that Musa, there were some things he didn't know, but Khidr knew them. So knowledge gave Khidr an advantage even over Musa. Imagine, Musa, Ulul Azm Prophet, Sahib al-Risala Prophet, Musa, the most mentioned prophet in the Quran, but still there was someone who Allah said, go find him. So there's a wisdom here, there's something within it, number one. Number two, when the angels, that I mentioned before, angels had a conversation with Allah. Now sometimes people ask this question that, for example, the angels, Allah created them. And when Allah created them, look, there's one dimension of it. They asked a question and they said, Ya Allah, are you going to make someone on this land who's going to cause bloodshed on earth? And Allah says, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. I know that which you do not know. I know what you don't know. So Allah is saying there are things that I know you don't know to the angels. Allah is telling Musa, there are things you don't know, you need to find someone else to tell you. Further than this, there's a moment in time in the Quran, Sulaiman. Allah says, in the Quran, He tells us the story of Sulaiman. Sulaiman is the son of Dawood. Sulaiman was given a kingdom like no one ever had. Kingdom of not only insan, also of animals. Jinni wal ins, all of the birds. Allah gave him mantiqut tayr, the ability to speak to the birds, for example, and the animals. So there's a moment in the time where he is talking and he's checking his rank and file. He's checking the attendance of all of his people that are under his dominion, including the animals. And then he's looking and one of the birds is missing. There's someone who's supposed to be in the lines, they're not there. There's a small bird missing, the hudhud bird, or the hoopoe bird. And Sulaiman says, where is this bird? I need an answer, otherwise there's going to be a punishment in order. And at that point in time, when he says this, according to the narrations in the Quran, the bird comes, and when the bird comes, Sulaiman asks him, what's the meaning of this? Why were you not where you were supposed to be? And then the bird says, I bring you knowledge which you do not know. A bird is telling Sulaiman, I know something you don't know. He says, so what is it? He says, I flew over a kingdom, I was flying over a kingdom of people, and they had a queen who was their leader. And on top of that, I realized that they were worshipping the sun. They were worshipping the sun. Now, he says something very interesting here. He says that sometimes when we see someone doing something that's not right, we automatically jump to saying, this is a bad person. Whereas the bird said something of hikmah, the bird said something of wisdom, the bird said, فَزَيَّنَهُ الشَّيْطَانِ. Shaitan has made it glittering and ornamenting. Shaitan has deluded them into thinking the sun is God. He didn't say, oh, they're worshipping God, they're all going to hell. He said, Shaitan has confused them. He has misguided them, and so now they are worshipping the sun. So when you see someone and they're doing something wrong, doesn't necessarily mean that they always have the wrong intent. So even Shaitan can get in the way. For example, when Adam and Hawa are they're exiting from Jannah, at that point in time, Allah in the Quran says, فَوَسْوَسَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانِ. Shaitan did waswas. And that affected. And so the idea is, and they did tarke awla. If I had time, I would explain what that is, the suboptimal path. Now stay with me here. So the Quran, Allah is constantly telling you and I, there are things that we may not know. Now stay with me here. I'll tell you something that may help you at the second level for university admissions and if you want to go to the top institutions. There's a book I recommend you read, it's called Noise. It's written by Dr. Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize in economics, although he was a psychologist. His first book I also recommend, it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. He talks about the brain and it's very interesting. So in this book Noise, he gives a study and he explains something. He says they took two candidates who were trying to get into the top universities and they were going for their admissions interview. And on paper, they were exactly the same. Same test scores, same grades, same extracurricular activities, same everything, number one. Number two, they prepared them in terms of the preparation for the answers the exact same way. Every single thing was the same. Now, every single time, they just were checking one thing, but they didn't tell the admissions counselor about any of this. They were running a study. And so every single time, one candidate was accepted and the other was rejected. And every time they asked the admissions counselor, why did you reject this candidate? Why did you accept this candidate? I mean, their grades, everything seems the same. So it boiled down to the interview. Even their answers they had prepped was the same. Now, when the researchers checked it, they found out that every single time the admissions counselors accepted one candidate, they rejected another candidate consistently, and there was a pattern. The pattern was, even the admissions counselor didn't know. When they asked, why did you reject this candidate? They made up some reason, but the reason wasn't logical. They said, oh, the answer to this question, which was the same as the other person. The only difference between the two categories was the weather outside. When it was sunny, they gave admission. When it was raining, they rejected the candidate. The admissions counselors themselves didn't know the weather was affecting them. If you go to places like Seattle or London, they have something called seasonal depression. The weather impacts your behavior and how you feel. So what I'm saying is, there are things that you don't even know that you don't know that are impacting you. One of them may be the weather. But is that some scientist whose whatever dynamic is supposed to tell me, or you or me as followers of Babel Madinatul Ilm should be telling the world? Don't take my word for it. Ayatollah Sistani Hafidhahullah writes in a letter of advice to young people. I invite you all to read it. I recommend you read it. In this letter, Sayyid Sistani, he says, I invite you to study and gain knowledge, and I invite you to specialize and try to go to higher levels of knowledge. You know, when you go higher up, you often specialize in different areas of knowledge. So go higher up. And then he says a third thing that I want you to never forget. He says that you go to universities and you study and you read textbooks from scholars. Are you also contributing to the body of literature? That is, are you also writing textbooks that others learn from or not? Or are you always going to be learning from someone else's textbooks? You know, the professors who write their textbooks in economics or physics or chemistry or X, Y, and Z. If you look at every single imam, from Amir al-Mu'mineen to the 11th imam, all of them in between, you will find even their enemies, every single one of them accepted that if you nothing else, these were men of knowledge. Even their enemy had to admit, number one. Number two, when it comes to, what is the Islamic basis of this? Allah's Messenger has told us that طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ وَمُسْلِمَةٍ. That is, to obtain knowledge is an obligation. Obligation on every male and female, not a choice. Now comes the question at the next level. What is ilm and knowledge according to the Ahlul Bayt? And we often think that, you know, Quran is Islamic knowledge, Hadith is Islamic knowledge, this is, you know, Hawza is Islamic knowledge, for example, and everything else is secular knowledge, for example. But the reality of the matter is, this is not quite what the Ahlul Bayt said. Example, the fifth Imam in Al-Kafi has a hadith where he has stated that ilm is only of two types, knowledge is only of two types. It is either qurbatan ilallah or not, that's it. Either it takes you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not, that's it. Meaning what? When you're studying physics, when you're studying chemistry, when you're studying X, Y, and Z, you're connecting that to Allah. That is ilm, that is knowledge. But we have created this world where inside these walls, this is where Islam is. And then when you go out there, that's not where Islam is. And that's not what Islam's vision is. We're living two lives. But Islam always wanted us to live one life. And in order to be a good Muslim, there is a prerequisite. You know how when you study calculus or you study advanced math, you have to first take algebra. And before algebra, you have to know your addition, subtraction, multiplication. There's a whole process that you go through in order to get the higher subjects. The same way if you want to be a doctor, you don't just go to med school right away. You have to first study a few things, like chemistry, organic chemistry, and biochemistry, and then eventually you get there. The same way, in order to be a Muslim, there is a prerequisite, and that is this. The prerequisite to being a good Muslim is to be a good human being. How is it possible that someone is saying, I'm a good Muslim, but they're not a good human being? Good human being was supposed to be an advanced form. Good Muslim is supposed to be an advanced form of good human being. Are you following what I'm saying? This notion of many people, and I've traveled and many people tell me the same thing, they say, you know, like some religious people, I don't want to be like them. Sometimes they say they act like they're better than you. Sometimes they have takabbur. Sometimes their akhlaq is not good. But mashallah, you know, they're very religious. That is not the vision of Islam. Islam was holistic. So what is knowledge and why is it so important? Next level. Letter 31 of Nahjul Balagha. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen says to his son Muhammad Hanafiya, study the pages of history. And I studied the pages of history up until it was as though I walked amongst the ruins of past civilizations. And I saw what brought them good and what brought them harm. You see, Imam is telling you when I just read history. What happens when you read history? What happens when you don't read history? What happens? When I try to read history, I try to read it as ibadah, as worship. When you study and you go to school, you should see it as ibadah and worship. When you go to work, you should see it as ibadah, as worship. Islam doesn't say that only when you open the Quran, only when you read salah, only when you fast, that's only ibadah. No. You're supposed to be in a state of ibadah from morning to evening, and from evening to morning, at every moment in time. But Islam was saying, Iman is your worship. So every breath you're taking is worship. If you have that niyyah, if you have that intent, that I'm trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm trying to learn. So now stay with me here. What about the scholars and the ulama? What about the Ahlul Bayt before them? If you read the lives of Imam Ali alayhi salam, if you read the life of Rasulullah, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussain, were they only discussing knowledge that was Islamic, so to speak? Or were they solving other problems of the world? I challenge you to look and check. Imam Ali alayhi salam, Rasulullah, I'll give you an example. When there used to be a war between Muslims and others, there used to be POWs on both sides. You know POWs, prisoners of war, on both sides, the norms. Rasulullah would say for the POW, there's two ways you can go free. One is either you become a Muslim and you become part of the community, you're the Muslim Ummah. And the other is you teach some Muslims how to, some knowledge. Read, write, something like this. Question, that person who came as a POW, were they teaching fiqh? Were they teaching usul? Were they teaching furu? Were they teaching Quran? They're not even Muslim. They don't know that. So Rasulullah understood there was a value in what they know to teach that. Otherwise, why would Rasulullah say to teach it and go free? Wow, we have forgotten what ilm is, what knowledge is. And it's so sad that as followers of Bab Madinatul Ilm, we are not leading the world in knowledge. We are not leading the world in academics. We are not leading the world in that yet. But your generation must change that. And today there's no excuse. Maybe at some time there may have been. I'm telling you this because there's so many needs that need to be looked at. Imam al-Baqir is solving the problem, the biggest problem of the era for the empire of Banu Umayyah. Although he doesn't agree with them, but he's helping the Muslim world. Which is what? He's helping solve the problem of currency, of finance, of the mint. The Muslim world did not know how to make coinage. In the IMF, the World Bank, the Federal Reserves and the likes, the currency issues. They didn't know how to make their own coins. They would get their coins from Byzantium. And so Byzantium had a monopoly. The Roman Empire had a monopoly. They said, okay, we want to make our own, but we don't know how. So who should we go to? They said, we need to go to the one who always solves our problems. Go to Ahlul Bayt. They called Imam al-Baqir. Imam al-Baqir said, I will show you, and I will solve the problem for you, and I'll show you how to make coinage. He solved that problem. Read the University of Imam as-Sadiq and how much he discussed chemistry and biology and astronomy and invited people to think about these things and analyze these things. Reflect on this. Furthermore, Allama Tabatabai, Sahib Tafsir al-Mizan, I want you to think about something. When he came to Najaf, he was praying to Allah for a teacher and a guide. And when he got there, eventually what happened was he did istighasa through Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he prayed to Allah that may I get a guide, a teacher, a mentor who can give me guidance. The next day, Allama Qadi Tabatabai came to his door, and he became his guide and mentor. He said, I want you to undertake the following education. He said, of course, make the arrangements for your fiqh classes and jurisprudence classes and all of those, but he said, I want you to make sure that you study riyadiyat, mathematics. You need to study math. Now someone would say, I'm studying in Hausa, why do you want me to study math? What does that have to do with Hausa? But he didn't say that. He found the best teacher in the Hausa for mathematics. So if there was a value of mathematics, there must have been a teacher, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense, right? So there was a teacher. And that teacher had to learn it because there was a value there. Stay with me here. He found the best teacher and he said, can you please give me some time so I can learn mathematics from you? And he said, I'm fully booked. I don't have any time, I apologize. He said, I have one time slot. Well, he insisted, and just one time, he said, one time slot, but it's the Zuhr time slot in the summer of Najaf. And nobody wants that. Of course you don't want that. Because it's too hot. He said, I'll take it. So in the heat of the summer, he would walk in the desert to his teacher, to his house, miles away, in order to learn mathematics. To the point that he used to be sweating. And he says that I was sweating so much and I would wash myself off at a nearby fountain before going to my mathematics teacher. So I didn't smell or embarrass myself or be disrespectful to him. He studied that and time passed. He went from Najaf to Tabriz, then he went on to Qom. And he stayed there for some time and taught and learnt and all of these things in the Hausa. Now, you may say, what's the wisdom behind that at that time? Why? Why study that? Time will tell. Many years later in Qom, Allama Hujjati needed to expand the Hujjatiyya seminary. When he needed to expand the Hujjatiyya seminary and construct more, he said, let us accept in blueprints. Let's take blueprints. A request for blueprints. An architect or a civil engineer, they get together, they make blueprints for construction. What is the design and all of these layout and those things. So he solicited and said, let's take an offers and requests. We want to get blueprints so we can expand the seminary that gives the best environment for the next generation to study in, that respects their needs. So every single time, the best architects and engineers were sending all of their blueprints. One after the other, Allama Hujjati would look at it, reject. Look, reject. Look, reject. Look, reject. They said, what's the problem? He said, these are the best engineers and architects in the country. What's the issue? He said, they're very good. The problem is, they are taking into account one dimension of the equation. They are not taking into account the way and the life and how our students need to live. So for example, if you're building something, you need to know the philosophy behind how it will be used. So students in a Hausa, for example, they have prayer needs, they have tahara needs, ablution needs, they have needs in terms of spaces to reflect on. There are so many different needs that they have that may not be in a traditional, for example, university. So you go to the main university here, you may or may not have some place to do wudu, for example. You may or not have a place to pray, for example, that's formulated. So he said it's only taking one dimension of the modern world into account, but it's not applying it to the Muslim community. So one after the other is rejecting, up until the point that he finally sees one blueprint, and he says, this is the one. This is the blueprint we will use. It is perfect. It takes into account modernity and the needs of our students. So when this happened, all the news began to spread amongst the students. How is it possible? Who submitted this blueprint? Who knew? Who solved the problem? So they said that there's some Sayyid who's moved from Tabriz recently. He's at this address, so if you can find it. So they got the address. A few tulaba went and they proceeded towards that. And they got to the door, they knocked the door. Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum assalam. When they saw it, it was Alama Tabatabai, who had submitted the blueprints. Those math classes, those trigonometry classes, those geometry classes that he had taken many years ago, in addition to the physics classes that he had done, may have paid dividends down the line, so he was able to apply the teachings of Islam in a practical framework for the world's needs. That was a physical building. Today, we need the same thing in physical buildings, but also in intellectual buildings. Someone who understands and people who understand the needs of our time and our eras. You have to give rise to that generation of scholarship that's needed. Before, the ulama did not separate these things. The scholarship in the past, for example, the likes of Khwaja Nasiruddin al-Tusi. Khwaja Nasiruddin al-Tusi was a scholar of the highest caliber. And he was someone who not only knew about Islam, but he knew about physics and mathematics and chemistry and geometry and astronomy. To the point that he had a catch and pitch relationship. His teacher was Allama Hilli. Allama Hilli used to teach Nasiruddin al-Tusi Quran and Islam and Hadith, but the same Allama Hilli would flip the script and learn from his student in terms of mathematics, astronomy and sciences. He was not arrogant, he was humble. He said that I know this, but I need to learn from him this, the sciences and the likes. And they would help each other. So remember, everything is something that is Islamic. If you want to connect that to Allah, connect that to the Ahlul Bayt, that is the journey. What happens when you don't have knowledge? What happens when we don't learn? What happens when we don't think through things? So now I want you to use some of the tools that we've been using a few nights ago. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Come with me to a time. The era is a few hundred years ago. The British are colonizing the world. And when the British are colonizing the world, they have now just come to India. India at the time is modern day India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. It's it's the largest country, 25% of the GDP of the world. And so when they get there, they set up their camp at Delhi. And they said, this is going to be our capital. When they get to Delhi, they said, we have a problem here. What's the problem? There's snakes, there's cobras. I don't know, imagine the British came here, there's boxing kangaroos everywhere. That's the issue was over there or something like that. So cobras are obviously much more dangerous and venomous or things of that nature perhaps. So he said, look, we have cobras here, we have snakes here, we have a big problem. We don't know how to deal with them, they're venomous, poisonous, they can kill us. What do we do? They said, let's do this. Let's give a bounty, a prize, for each dead cobra that someone brings. The locals know how to deal with it. They'll kill the cobras and bring them to us. We'll pay them some money. For us it's cheap. And they'll solve the problem. So they did it. They implemented it. They announced it to the people. They said, from tomorrow we're going to implement a bounty program. For every dead cobra you bring us, we'll give you money. Maybe 2 rupees, 3 rupees. A lot of money at the time. So one after the other, people began to bring these and take the money from the British, and the graph began to go down. But over time, then eventually the graph then began to stabilize. And then after a few more days, eventually the graph began to go up. So the British were like, we are getting all these cobras, we're paying money, but the number of cobras is going up, it's not going down. In the city, what's going on? They were analyzing this, what's going on. So they launched an investigation. When they launched an investigation, they found out that the local Indian community, when they heard about the bounty program, they began to farm the cobras. They said, we can make money off of this. For the first time, someone had given the British a run for their money. And they said, what on earth? Someone outsmarted us, so they got very upset. And when they got very upset, they said, from tomorrow we're not giving any money at all. Zero. And the Indians said, oh really? Okay. So they said, we'll do something in return. They took the farmed cobras and they released all of them into the city. The niyyah of the British was to get rid of the cobras. What ended up happening was they ended up with 3 times more cobras. This is called the cobra effect. Second degree consequences, when you don't think things through. I'll tell you what happened in America. In America, when people began to come, at least in our communities, the Indo-Pak subcontinent communities in the 50s and 60s, you can ask the Lebanese community what happened there in the 1800s. We'll leave that to the side. They first had a good niyyah. Good niyyah was, we will keep the programs classical, traditional in our language. Niyyah was, inshallah, as the Maraji have said, by the way, teach your kids your mother tongue and language. It's very recommended. If you can, it's beautiful. But not everyone can, or for whatever reason. But anyways, the intent was we're going to have classical programming and we're going to be able to teach our next generation the language. Good niyyah, good intent. So the majalis continued in the classical traditional way. Fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, nobody's in the Imam Banka, nobody's in the Hussain, it's empty. Because no one got the religion. Because they assumed that people understood the language, the next generation. They didn't. And so they lost it. We lost several generations already. Number 1. Number 2, drugs. You know, marijuana, you've heard of cannabis? So people say it's safe. It's becoming legalized all over America. Now, when someone tries this, it's like playing Russian roulette. You've heard of Russian roulette? Russian roulette is a game, they say, where you have a gun, a pistol, and in it you have one bullet that you put in the chamber, and you just keep pulling the trigger, and you do some other stuff, but you don't know if this bullet will kill you or not. Will the chamber be empty or not? When you use this, it's like that, based on your genes. Why am I saying this to you? Why is ilm so important? If you read the works of someone like Dr. Robert Sapolsky or others at Stanford University, we know that based on gene variants, people who have a certain gene variant and they are predisposed, they are 7 times more likely to be a victim of psychosis if they use cannabis, especially prior to the age of 25, when the mind is developing. Number 1. Why do we need knowledge? Do you know how much sugar you are consuming in these nights of Ayyam Azab? Do you know how bad sugar is for you? Ask someone who studies oncology and cancer research, they will tell you how poisonous it is for your body. But us as followers of Ahlul Bayt, we're behind the curve. When will we get ahead of the curve? You know, it wasn't always like this. I want to share with you. There was a time in the history of the world where for 300 years they say Baghdad was the center of knowledge. 800 to 1100 AD. This is where the likes of algebra comes from. The likes of chemistry and the like. Many things emerged from that era and that time. Now, the first book at that time for mathematics that was written was a book called Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabil. This is the first book on algebra that we have documented. It was written by a guy named Muhammad al-Khawarizmi. Now, does anyone know where the x comes from? You know, when you solve in mathematics, if 2x equals 6, you divide both sides by 2x equals? Yeah. So why x? Why not A or B or C or D? Why the letter X? I mean, theoretically you can use any of the letters, but we use X as a convention throughout the world. Why? And you'll find that when the first book on mathematics was written, Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabil by Muhammad al-Khawarizmi, when they wrote the book, there were no equations in that book. All they had in the book was sentences, word problems. And so they would say, 3 times a thing is equal to 6, or 2 times a thing is equal to 6. And they would say that, and they would write it. And so when this book from Arabic was translated into Greek, the Greek said, hold on a second, we don't have a word for this. So 2 times a thing equals 6. In Arabic, 2 times a thing, the word for thing in Arabic is shay. Shay. 2 times a shay is equal to 6. Now on top of that, for a learning moment, if we don't know that, how much of the Quran do we understand? Leave that for another day. Shay. So the Greeks said, hold on a second, Shay, I don't know what that, we don't have that. So they said, what's the closest thing in Greek to the Arabic word Shay? They said chi. You know, chi-squared statistics is a letter in the Greek alphabet. So they put chi. So then they went to Urdu, from Greek to Latin. When they translated that from Latin to Greek, they said, Greek, we don't have chi. What is the closest thing to chi? And if you look at chi and x, they look very similar between the two languages. That's the origin of where the x came from. Further to this, our world runs on what? An algorithm. Algorithm is a Latinization of Khawarizmi. You know, Google, Meta, all these companies, they use algorithms. That's based on that. Now, and I can go on for hours. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, his book Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb was the book of, it was the main textbook on medicine throughout the world up until about 400 years ago. And I can go on and on and on, but remember one thing. A nation, a people who are always looking in the rear view mirror, where are they not looking? They're not looking ahead. So it's time for us to stop saying, we used to be amazing, we used to be this, we used to be that, and start charting the future. But if you and I as followers of Babe Madinatul Ilm are not able to do that, then who will? You know how many challenges there are in our communities, in our society? Read history. You know what one of the biggest problems that's going on in our community globally is? Nobody can get along. You know this? Tribalism. In Shiaism. I'm not talking about others, I'm talking about our communities. They can't get along. We can't get along. And every time that's been the case, people have exploited. Read the history. How did the British take over in a place like, for example, Afghanistan, where nobody was able to take over? The Russians failed. Everybody failed. Nobody could conquer. They used one technique: divide and conquer. They said, oh, these are Shias, these are Sunnis, let's pit them against each other. And every time they use this framework over and over again. As an example, us as followers of Ahlul Bayt, our level of tolerance and akhlaq, I'm speaking globally, you know what the consequences of these things are? Read the history of Europe. I would invite you to read a book, it's called The Sovereign Individual. And it talks about the phases of history, and it tells you that if you read the history of Europe, you'll find that first people were very religious. And then eventually, they started fighting, Catholics and Protestants. And when they started fighting, over time, eventually, people said, all religious people, all they do is fight. Let's get rid of religion. And they threw away religion. When you notice that people who say they are religious and they have the worst of akhlaq, it damages Islam more than it helps Islam. Because people say, if this is Islam, I don't want to have to do this. I don't want to be like this. So what is true Islam? Islam is walking, breathing Islam. Islam is in your akhlaq, in your mannerisms, in your etiquette, in your ethics. That when you are in society, when you are there, people say, who's the best of society? It should be one of you, one of us. In every aspect of life. But until we emphasize, and we don't emphasize knowledge, we will suffer. Do you know how many youth from our community are suffering? Just like the broader community. I'm not just saying all of our community. I'm not saying it out of my pocket. What I'm saying is the broader society is suffering, and our community is part of the broader society. So we are also suffering. It's not like something that we are exempt from. You know, it breaks my heart how many parents that I've seen from our communities who have to bury their child because of an overdose, for example, on drugs. But you know what's really sad? They can't talk about it because of shame. And so they bury their child, and then on top of that, you have to deal with your child dead, and on top of that, you have to deal with not being able to grieve because you don't want anyone knowing. When will we solve these problems? Or are we just going to exist? Allah sent you and I into this world for a reason. Knowledge has the power, the keys to solve many of our problems. Maybe not all, but many. So what does that mean? If you know something in terms of knowledge, You should present that and help educate others in the community to solve these problems. This, I'm saying this next line, maybe one person may understand what I'm saying, and maybe some online may, but I have to say this so eventually someone does it, and that is this. For my next generation, work on trying to build an idea meritocracy for our communities. That's the only way we'll be able to work together in the future. The best ideas come to the top. As long as we are tied to egos, we won't be able to do it. The top companies, the top banks, the top institutions, the top governments in the world have already implemented this. Idea meritocracy. So it's not about you, me, who put in the idea. The idea is what is the best idea to implement, and that goes to the top. Otherwise, how will we progress? Otherwise, how will we go forward? Knowledge. طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم ومسلمة. It doesn't just mean degrees, that's just the start. Someone says, you go to a doctor and say, doctor says, look, I'm looking at your metrics, I'm looking at your blood work, I'm looking at your, chemicals in your body, I'm looking at everything. You need to work out and you need to diet and exercise. And I say to the doctor, no, don't worry. I did diet and exercise. He said, when did you do diet and exercise? I did diet and exercise when I was in college, when I was in junior college, when I was in secondary. He said, Baba, now you're older now. It doesn't work like that. You just did it then. That was good. You need to still do it. But in our world, somehow you study for 2 years, 5, 4 years, whatever, and then studying is done. That's not Islam. In Islam, at every moment you must be learning. You must be educating yourself. So many of the problems that you see in our communities have already been solved by others. All you have to do is read a little, share that knowledge and wisdom, and then we grow as a community. Otherwise, what will happen is before you. The Ahlul Bayt did a lot, and the Shia throughout times did a lot, so that you and I can call ourselves followers of Ahlul Bayt. But if we don't prioritize knowledge, the Ahlul Bayt have said, Rasulullah has said, knowledge is the lost property of a mu'min, of a believer. You should get it from wherever you can. And that's so important for us to reflect on, because we're supposed to be helping society better. Our responsibility is not just to you and I. Our responsibility is also to our local brethren and our friends. If the system is doing dhulm on others, you and I should try to make the system more just. Or what about what's going on abroad? If there are Shias being persecuted, how do you change that? Just the other day, a Maulana in Para Chinar, he says, killing Shia is the best thing in terms of religion. So how do you counter that? If the people don't have knowledge, you can say whatever they want to them and they'll believe you. That means you have to get knowledge, and you have to know not only your belief system, but you have to be like Imam as-Sadiq. And Imam as-Sadiq knew his religion and he knew all the fiqh of everyone else also. So if someone wanted an answer, he could give them an answer from their own pocket. So how do you counter that? You have to know the religion and the belief of what the scholarship and the other school of thought said, and try to explain and say, Maulana, Sheikh, you said this, but these other scholars from your own school don't agree with you. So where did you come from? Where did this come from? Knowledge is the key to eradicating these problems. But until and unless you and I don't feel, we get in the West and we get comfortable. Not everyone, but some people. Alhamdulillah, I have my problem solved. You know the first world problems? Have you heard of this? Have you heard of third world problems? You go to third world, quote unquote. People have to walk miles to get water. They have to come walk miles to, some of them don't have electricity, they're suffering. They have to deal with big problems. First world problems? First world problems is I went to Starbucks, and they're out of my drink. My day is finished. La ilaha illallah. My phone battery is dead. I have a charger, but the cable is only 2 feet. Outlet is 6 feet away. I have to stand up and go and plug it in. We sometimes forget. But then when we come into comfort, we don't remember the people we have responsibilities to, locally and abroad. If dhulm is happening in this society, on anyone, you and I have a responsibility. Was Imam Ali alayhi salam only looking after Muslims? If we think that, we have not studied Imam Ali alayhi salam. Imam Ali alayhi salam is in the city, and there is a Christian man who has gone blind. He's not able to work. He's not physically able to work. He's disabled. Imam Ali is saying he's begging. He's begging in the streets. He says, why is he begging? What's going on here? He said, Ya Ali, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, he's incapacitated. He can't work anymore. So he has to beg. Imam Ali says, how unjust. We used him while he was able to work. And now he's not able to work. We leave him to beg in the street. I will not move here until he gets a pension from the Baytul Mal, the public treasury. You see, Islam was about everyone. That's why that if you study the history of Islam, Islam spread like wildfire amongst the African American community in America, for example. The oppressed communities always said Islam is given rights to human beings like no one else has. But if you and I don't understand this, what will happen? The same way there's the Cobra effect, there are other things that happen in society that you and I may not be aware of. Another time, inshallah. But just remember, all of the Ahlul Bayt were intellectuals, were academics, were people of knowledge, and they did not differentiate between this knowledge or that knowledge. It was knowledge for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was the knowledge that allowed the greatest to become the greatest of the great.